Hello, welcome back to the channel. In this video, we are going to be talking about Thor 4, Thor Love and Thunder. I am excited to jump right into this. So overall, I do think that the fact that this is a comedy film is allowing me to think of this film in a different light. I really enjoyed the film coming out of the theater, but in terms of the overall plot, I do think that there are better films within the MCU. Regardless, I do think that I am going to say that I really enjoyed this movie because of the fact that it made me smile, it made me laugh at times, and it was just a ton of fun in theaters. Overall though, in the actual plot, I do think that there are things that probably could have been done better, and I will probably talk about that as I get into more of the spoilers of this film. That being said, if you haven't watched this movie, what I will say is that if you want to just sit back, relax, have a good time, not think too deeply about what's going on, but just have fun, maybe have a few laughs, this is definitely the film for you. If you want like a plot that's on par with some of the top tier MCU films, I would say maybe not. Maybe this film isn't the best for you, but if you want to have a good time, it's definitely that. Without further ado, let's get into spoilers. So if you haven't watched the film yet, click off here and come back once you have. So to begin, let's talk about the other gods that we see in this movie. And I just wanted to mention my thoughts about the gods in general, in this world, in this universe, and what I think about them. So specifically, I gotta say, Zeus kind of sucks, and it's kind of sad to see that, but also, like, I understand that they're trying to create, like, a more comedic tone for this film. I think it works for the movie, but seeing how incompetent all these gods are, pretty much just living in fear and wanting to stay hidden, it's just sad to see. And to be honest, I feel like Thor himself should have been more angry or pissed at the existence of these gods, especially because they stood by during Ragnarok and did nothing, and they stood by during the snap and the 5 years that persisted after that. They were utterly useless to the entirety of the universe as far as we can tell, because all we know is that Carol was out there helping people in the rest of the universe, and then on top of that, the Avengers were here on Earth. Of course, Thor was pretty depressed during that time because he had pretty much lost everything, so that's understandable. But as far as we can tell, the philosophy of these gods here are, you know, if you lose, it's on you, it's whatever, it's your problem. And so I feel like that just competes with a lot of what Thor believes in, and I feel like that conflict could have been more interesting had they chosen not to go with the comedic route. And I feel like that's how I feel about a lot of the things in this movie, where it's fine if you want to just sit back and have fun, which I definitely did, but they could have had a much more serious or a much more interesting plot if they actually took some of the elements a little bit more seriously. That being said, I do think that they could have had fun with the comedic elements of this film while still also having serious moments and actually taking the events as to what's going on with a serious tone, with actually having them have consequences, things like that, that actually mattered. I just felt as though the entire film, like the serious elements, the loss, is a bit undercut with the way that they chose to go about doing things. That being said, I did enjoy the elements of actually seeing the gods themselves. I thought it was funny to see some of the things here. I just do wonder what the actual cosmology of this is now, because, like, why is it that some characters die like gods and spark into smoke, while other gods like Loki just die? Does that mean that, like, Loki isn't technically a god at that point? Is that just because he's a frost giant that he doesn't count? Are all Asgardians considered gods? Like, what is the actual thing here? Like, what is the logistics? What is the actual underlying reasoning as to what's going on, right? I do want to have a better understanding of that, and I feel like we might just never get an answer, which is kind of sad considering everything is meant to be connected and make sense with one another in terms of the overarching MCU. Alright, another kind of disappointing element to this movie is the entirety of Jane's storyline, I feel like. I thought we were going to get a much more in-depth look at her cancer storyline, as well as the fact that she becomes Thor. I think that the way in which it happens, the way in which she becomes Thor, is kind of underwhelming. I mean, it doesn't seem all that interesting. I feel like it would have been a lot cooler to say either she became Thor during the snap or she became Thor because she was working with the Asgardians trying to put together Mjolnir again, and from there, after being pieced together, she gained the powers of Thor using some pieces of science to complement maybe the enchantment, or perhaps she just became worthy after rebuilding Mjolnir, or perhaps we can also talk about the living storm within the actual hammer. There are many ways that I think would have been much more interesting than just Jane heard the hammer calling to her, she showed up and picked up the hammer, or even the slight implication that maybe Thor unknowingly altered the enchantment on the hammer so that the hammer would want to protect Jane. I mean, I think that they could have either done a lot more in terms of explaining that, or having it be like maybe Thor has some ability to enchant that he was never really aware of, something similar to how Odin is capable of enchanting and using magic, and it's just something like that's innate within Thor that he just hasn't harnessed yet. Like, I think they could have made it a much bigger deal, a much more interesting element to the story, and they just chose not to do that, again because the story is a comedy and there's only so much of the actual like serious plot or elements that you can actually have, while also saying that everything's kind of hilarious and jokey at the same time. Similarly, to me, it kind of felt like Jane was only there to work through Thor's actual problem of not having a purpose, and I think that that's kind of undercutting the fact that Jane in her own right is a Thor, and in her own right is a very intriguing character. I mean, the fact that this character is capable of becoming Thor even while continuously going through chemotherapy, and the ability to grab that hammer is destroying and eradicating the chemotherapy in her body. I mean, it is an active choice that Jane is making in order to continue saving lives, and as a result, she's going to die from her cancer. I feel as though that is a much more compelling story than just saying the hammer is killing her. It could have been done a lot better. That's all I'll say on this. I think that Jane is kind of wasted, especially if this is the end of her character. The only thing I can think of is they somehow bring her back for the next film with maybe something like Mangog being the villain, and also relating that somewhat to the storm cloud, or the actual like living storm that exists out there. I mean, it could be interesting to see, but again, with the fact that this whole thing was undercut by Thor's story, making it seem like she was only there to complement or fit into what Thor was missing, it just felt odd to me, and it kind of felt cheapened, or like, I don't know, it just felt weird to me. Let me know your thoughts on that in the comments below. Next, let's talk about Gorr, okay? I think Gorr was really good in this film. I really liked Christian Bale in this role. His physicality, his maneuvers, his like mannerism, everything like fit very well with this story. I think they did a very good job with this, and especially with the look, everything looked fantastic. The dimension or the area in the universe that he was from, it all looked very, very visually appealing, and I think that that's something that they did very, very well. What I will say though is, after watching some other reviews and thinking about it some more myself, I do think that in truth, this is not necessarily the villain that you want in a comedic story. I mean, the idea that Gorr the God Butcher is massacring gods, right? Left, right, and center. It's not really a funny story. And I think they did something similar with Ragnarok, and it's just intriguing to me that they're choosing to like do this thing where they make Thor films hilarious, which I love, right? The comedy is great in these films, but also the actual stories are undercut because of it, because they're essentially saying that this super serious and intriguing and wonderful story is just going to be boiled down to like jokes and like not really be as heavily high stakes and stuff like that. So I don't know how I feel about this, right? On one hand, I can sit down and watch these Thor films and have a good time because they are fun, but at the same time, you're thinking like Gorr the God Butcher, as well as Ragnarok, could have been super serious and super intriguing and game-changing movies in the MCU to the same level of films like Endgame or Infinity War, right? And yet we're seeing something completely different. And I don't think it's completely bad, right? I really enjoyed this film. I'm prefacing this with that. But then again, I can't help but wonder what we're missing out with the element of the more serious side of the Thor mythos. I mean, it's just something that I've been thinking about ever since Ragnarok came out. Furthermore, the idea of like the Necro Sword corrupting Gorr and like the entire visuals of his powers, I think all that's well and good. I think it's well done. I believe it's a slight departure from his character in the comic books. I don't think that the actual sword is corrupting him in the comics, but I don't think that's very important. I just think that it's done fine there, and I think that with what they did, I think it was done well. I do want to talk about something I find very intriguing, and I think it relates back to the idea of the Thor enchantment with Jane's hammer with Mjolnir, and that is the fact that Thor now has the ability to use enchantments. Now, my curiosity on this is, did Thor ever train to use enchantments? Is he completely doing this by happenstance? And also, like, didn't Loki have to train in magic to use enchantments, to use illusions, to do these things, right? Whereas, why is Thor just capable of doing that? It kind of feels like they're undercutting the years of study that Loki and Sylvie did to gain their respective magical prowesses, right? And again, I understand that the movie is a film, but also when you tie it into the larger Marvel landscape, I don't know that it makes much sense. And I think that it kind of undercuts some other characters that we've seen so far in this universe. And it's just kind of weird that they didn't try to actually put in more effort to, yes, make a fun comedy, but also make it fit in with the things that already pre-existed and predate it, especially the things that are coming out now. Right? Loki came out last year, and you don't really want to undercut that story with a storyline that's coming out a year later by saying that Thor is just able to create enchantments without any magical study at all, as far as we're aware. He is not a magician. We've never seen him use magic before, and yet he is doing enchantments in this movie all the time. Well, not all the time, but still, he's using an enchantment for all these little kids to become little Thors, and then he also uses an enchantment to alter Mjolnir's capabilities earlier in the story. It's interesting. It's interesting that they went down this road, and I'm curious to know if people at Marvel that were higher up actually signed off on this, or if they just didn't bother to check. That's something that I'm curious about, because it's just weird, because also similarly, like, Jane is using the other hammer here too, and it's curious because why are they able to use his axe, right? His axe is supposedly capable of frying people from the inside if they use it and they're not strong enough, and yet we've seen Cap use it and we've seen Jane use it now too, and they're both human. So I'm really curious to know what the reasoning here is. Are they just like saying things and then throwing them out immediately afterwards? It's something that is a bit bothersome, but more specifically with the actual kids, right? The visuals this scene brought about is hilarious, right? I was laughing, I was having a wonderful time. And again, I'm not saying that I disliked this film. I really enjoyed the film, but again, if you're gonna have a comedy here, it still has to fit in with the larger narrative, with the actual kids themselves, right? Heimdall's kid, I mean, brand new character, they just made him up for this film, but I think he works fine for the overall plot, and I like him. He's a fun enough character, and also seeing everyone using the abilities of Thor and stuff like that, very, very fun. The little bunny rabbit that is enchanted, it's really, really cool to see, and a lot of fun. I was also a little stressed out that some of these kids would die and Thor would have to explain that to to their parents, but that didn't happen. I guess just because the movie is a comedy, they didn't really want to go down that route, but realistically, in this actual world, these kids would, like, half of them would be dead. But again, like, it's fun for what it is. Now let's talk about the Well of Eternity. Now, I was pretty surprised that we were going down this route. I think that it works well enough for the story, but again, I am curious to know why Eternity wasn't animated, why he didn't get a personality, why the heck was he just sitting there, right? Why couldn't they just create Eternity and actually use Eternity? And also, like, is this Eternity then going to be playing a bigger role later on down the line? Are they really going to use this Thor film as a huge piece of Marvel cosmology, right? I mean, I have no idea. I have no idea. I think they kind of have to because of what they did in this movie, right? They brought in Eternity, they brought in these statues of the Living Tribunal and the Watcher that are laying in the background, and so I feel like this movie is also hugely impacting the Marvel landscape while also being, like, in the midst of a comedic bubble, and I'm not too sure how I feel about that. That being said, I do think that the whole like Gorr having a change of heart at the last second and bringing like a kid out of nowhere, like things like that are a little weird. I didn't think they were really necessary, and they're a bit out of left field, especially with what Thor's journey was so far. Also, the idea that Stormbreaker is the key to get to the Well of Eternity is a bit of like a plot like convenience. It's a bit random, like why couldn't it be anything else? Why does it have to be Stormbreaker that's used for this? I mean, Gorr wasn't even looking for Thor to begin with, so why is this a thing, right? They just kind of, it feels like this was kind of like a last minute or rush decision, or a thing in which they had to make Gorr's conflict tie directly to Thor just because, and I don't think it was necessary. It would have been more interesting, I feel like, for Jane to get to survive here by Thor wishing for her to continue on. And I think this makes sense because of how there was a conversation with Darcy earlier in this movie about how, hey, why don't we go and check with Thor and see if he has a way to help you? And they just don't do that. It's weird because they bring it up earlier in the story, and it would have been a plot thread that just kind of made sense considering it was built in earlier in the story, and they just don't use it. So I'm curious to know if that was an initial plan, and if this whole child thing that literally comes about in the last like 5-10 minutes of the movie was thought about later on down the line. Maybe Natalie Portman didn't want to continue on with this character. I have no idea, but it just feels like it was built in at the last second. Finally, let's talk about Thor's journey in this movie. And I feel like in part, it's like he has a couple of different pieces that happen in this story. First, he's given everything up. He's hanging out with the Guardians, and he's not really sure of what to do next, and he's not really having a good time. He's not doing what he wants to do, and yet, like, he's just chilling, zen, laying about, not really sure what to go and do next, and then he just gets a conversation with Peter Quill, and Quill's like, you know, why don't you get a girlfriend, essentially? And then Jane just appears. That's his arc there. And it's like, okay, so his story is going to be that he needs to find Jane and be with Jane, and that's going to be his new purpose. And even if he loses Jane, he'll at least have had love for this story, and yada, yada, yada. That's what's going on. And then it just takes a left turn later on down the line where he's going to be a dad instead. Also, they could have done a much more interesting thing, like I mentioned earlier, in which he comes into a understanding with Gorr and actually understands and sympathizes with what he's doing, because all the gods apart from Thor seem to be utterly useless, which is like I don't care about any of these gods. They could honestly all die because they don't care about helping the universe at all. They're just sitting in their tower doing nothing, and honestly, Gorr is right to want to kill all of them at that point. Like, they're utterly useless. And so I feel as though Thor would be the god to actually question that, and yet he just doesn't. That being said, that's all I really have to say for this film. Let me know your thoughts on the movie itself. Like, did you enjoy it as a comedy, but do you also agree with me? Like, do you think that there are elements of this story that just kind of undercut what could have been? Do you think that there are elements here that could have been taken a little bit more seriously, a different route that could have been more entertaining for us to see as viewers? I feel that that's a potential avenue that they could have done. Just let me know if you agree. Also, let me know if you have anything else you'd like me to talk about in the future on this channel, and like the video if you liked the video. And as always, subscribe for more videos from me on this channel. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Have a wonderful day.